Hello from Los Angeles. It's very early here, but I'm happy to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. It was so nice to see Elizabeth a few months ago at the opening of the Herbert-Bayer Center, the Resnick Center for Herbert-Bayer Studies in Aspen, and then to be asked to present. And initially, I was just going to talk about the anthology paintings, but then I was asked to talk more about the center itself. And so it's with great pleasure that I can present both of these things to you. And I'm so happy to see Gwen. I haven't seen her in ages. She was my mentor, my guide, my great supporter early on when I started researching the work of Herbert Bayer, and was so encouraging that it made me want to continue. So thank you, Gwen, for everything you've done for Herbert in the past and continue to do. And it's so wonderful to be able to connect here on this platform and to be with you in Lentos digitally or virtually and share this special day with you. So I'm going to share my screen so I can begin my presentation. I hope you can see that. Is that visible? Yes. So I started doing exhibitions. I work for Linda and Stuart Resnick, sorry, and I've been their curator for nearly 30 years. And in 2005, Linda and Stuart bought their first Herbert Bayer works and have not stopped since then, and asked me in 2007 to curate one exhibition, which was, I focused on the early work of Herbert Bayer. Then in 2009 on the anthology series, in 2018 on mountains and convolutions. And then for the centennial of the Bauhaus, did this exhibition called Total Work of Art, Bauhaus Bayer Aspen, in which Bayer featured prominently among how he was at the Bauhaus and then what he did in Aspen. And then now for the inaugural exhibition of the new center, I did this exhibition. These are the catalog covers, and it's called Herbert Bayer, an Introduction, and I will talk about it in a little bit. So as you know, Herbert Bayer, Austrian-born, 1900, very nice year, because we can always tell what his age is, and a very handsome man who, even with Gary Cooper, who was a very handsome actor, he still outshone him physically. Anyway, he came to Aspen at the invitation of Walter Pepke and moved there in 1946, initially helped revitalize the town. And then after the Goethe bicentennial in 49 and the founding of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, Herbert Bayer began designing that campus, which ultimately became his Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art that we so appreciate today for how amazing this masterpiece of his is. And the first building he did was the seminar building in 1953, followed by the lodges and chalet, and then the health center in 55. The campus kept growing. After Walter Pepke passed away, this beautiful design was executed. And keep this image in mind because I will refer to it in a bit. But the way he nestled this building beautifully into the overall scheme of the seminar building from 53 and the new building from 62. And in the background, you can see the rest of the campus. And there was this big void between the two areas. And in 71, Herbert came up with this amazing earthwork, which is known as Anderson Park, which graces this beautiful campus and which really unites the West End to the East End. And many people, even people who were born there, have no idea that this was designed. They think it was naturally made. But it's so beautifully incorporated, as Herbert wanted everything to be incorporated into this campus. And so throughout the years, Linda Resnick has kept saying, as Gwen mentioned, she championed Herbert Bayer and she wanted the Institute to pay big and more important tribute to what he did for not just the Institute, but the whole town of Aspen. And she said, look around you. His work is everywhere. His architecture, his sculpture, his artwork, his tapestries, they grace the exterior and interior of all the campus. Why isn't he better appreciated? And this is the wonderful anaconda that Gwen was talking about, that the Aspen Institute purchased from Denver Art Museum, and we installed it near the Pepke building. And in 2019, finally, the Aspen Institute said, yes, we're going to partner and do something about Herbert-Bayer. And so the Resnick gave a $10 million gift to start this process. So here you see a map of the whole campus. And so the idea started, where do we place a new building? Since there is no more build-up space, there was no space where we could build, because all this area that you see in the middle is preserved and could not be built on. And people know the campus primarily from the west end. You can see my cursor, hopefully, and would cross Anderson Park to some meetings here. But very few people ever ventured to the east end, where there was a building that Herbert had designed. And so the blue arrow tells you where we decided we would place the building. It's the southeast corner, which neighbors the music festival and the physics center, but also the neighborhood. And this is through Google Map, you can see that the campus of the Institute really takes up this whole part, but the music center is over here, and the physics center is here, and the neighbors all are on these two sides. And so when you look at this corner here, and this is a picture I took in 2019, you could not tell that this was where the Institute began. And it was so covered up, people just walked by it, not knowing what was behind these trees and shrubs. And when you walked behind those trees and shrubs, there was Herbert's final building, the Betcher building, a building that people would never use the front entrance, which was over here, but instead would enter it from the side because nobody came to this area. So we thought this would be a very good place to position a new building. Working with the architect Jeff Burkus, who had designed some buildings on the campus, but whose father was a neighbor and friend of Herbert-Bayer's in Montecito, he and I worked together to come up with a scheme. And we figured we needed to pay tribute to Herbert-Bayer in every possible way we could. So if you remember the image I told you to keep in mind, where Herbert inserted the Pepke building with the seminar building, we thought, how do we go about putting a building with one that already exists without taking away from it, but adding to it? So a small footprint was decided that would be visible. And so in plan, the ground level is a very small space that you walk in. There's a very large gallery surrounded by smaller galleries, and then you walk down or take the elevator down to more galleries downstairs, but we have a bigger footprint where we could have more space, art storage, and an archive. And we thought this would help create an intimate exhibition space, much, much smaller than any place exists in Denver or Lentos. And we hoped we could, create something special there. So one of the things, again, how do we pay tribute? So the arrival court that is in front of the building, as you saw in the earlier part, was gridded. But instead of doing a grid, we decided to take one of Herbert's beautiful painting, Amphora Blue, that's the Lentos, and minimize it to essential lines and use those. When you pour concrete, you need to create expansion lines like you see here, because concrete expands and contracts. So these lines are very necessary to keep the concrete from breaking. So we thought, what nicer way is there to do this than to be inspired by Herbert and use one of his paintings as an inspiration to welcome you into the center. We also know that Herbert loved the Fibonacci sequence, as you can see in one of the examples, Fibonacci in Las Vegas, a humorous piece. Among many serious pieces, this is really, I love this piece because of its lightness. So the Fibonacci sequence, for those of you not familiar with, is this beautiful mathematical sequence that has been found to be present in nature, whether in a spiral of a nautilus or in a sunflower. And Herbert found the beauty in this sequence and used it throughout his late compositions. And so we thought, here we have an opportunity to take that sequence. When you take the sequence, you can form this beautiful spiral. And that spiral, when you superimpose it, starting from the arrival court, it terminates in the center of the Betcher building. And so we thought how beautiful it is that we have taken something Herbert cares about and managed to make a connection between his last building that he created and a new building created in his honor. So we have the Fibonacci walkway that leads you to the blue amphora arrival court. And then finally, we needed a more physical way of welcoming people and making Herbert being felt right from the get-go. And as you recall, that this corner was a very, very closed off corner. Nobody knew this campus or this area existed. So we looked at Herbert's work, and with the permission of Jonathan Bayer, his last surviving heir, we were given permission to recreate on a much smaller scale this maquette of the four gates from 1982. And this is a rendering that we had initially created. The gates here look much larger. Ultimately, we reduced their scale to make them much more human. And we opened up this corner now to allow people to see the two buildings, Herbert's last building and the new center devoted to him. And in reality, this is what the finished product looks like. As Elizabeth can attest, it's really a very human scale. There's some beautiful pictures of Elizabeth standing beneath these gates that I have and I treasure from when she visited. And it has become a, let's say, where people take their selfies and pictures because it's such a amazing addition, and people have just fallen in love with it, just like they have fallen in love with Anaconda that you saw earlier. This has added a really wonderful presence to the campus and has created a new entrance to the campus that people did not use before. And the way we welcome them is seeing the Betcher and the Bayer Center. So this is what the Bayer Center looks like. We were inspired by Gropius's building in Dessau, the Bauhaus building, taking elements from that, keeping it very simple, very low profile, using steel, stone, and stucco. Then when you walk in, the first gallery is the largest gallery, and really you feel the sense of light and air coming into this. You see the glass elevator over here and the staircase that take you downstairs. So when I was asked to do the inaugural exhibition, I was very inspired by Elizabeth's 2009 exhibition that she did on Ahoy Herbert, and decided, let's again do a mini retrospective in our tiny gallery spaces and with whatever pieces we could borrow from private collectors, from museums, and from the small collection that the Institute had. And rather than start the exhibition on the upper level when you walk in, we decided to start the exhibition below. And the reason I called it Herbert-Bayer an introduction is, especially in 2019 when the Bauhaus was being celebrated, Herbert was being mentioned as a designer, always as a designer, and very few people talked about him as a painter. And throughout his life, Herbert wrote and said that he was first and foremost a painter, and that what activated his mind every day was the act of drawing and painting, and he loved that. And I wanted to bring that aspect of his work back and introduce it to people who were not familiar with the range of work that he had created. I mean, at the Denver Art Museum at the Lentos, you are so lucky to have so many pieces that you can always look at them, but there was very little in Aspen where we could show that. So starting with early works from, in this case, 1919, the galleries moved chronologically through time, highlighting some of the works he did decade by decade. So when you zoom out from that initial gallery and you step back, you're looking at works from the 1930s. They will be flanked on the left and right by works in design as well, like the covers for the Neue Linie, along with the paintings. And then to the right, again, more paintings. And then when you go into the next gallery, the commercial work that he did in Berlin and the Bauhaus exhibition he did for MoMA in 1938. So these early galleries here cover the 19 teens to the 30s till he comes to New York. And then in the next gallery, we move into the 40s with the early war pictures that eventually give way to the mountains and convolutions of the mid 40s and late 40s into the 50s. And then in the next gallery of the 1950s show Herbert's fascination with structure, whether it's natural, man-made, or the structures he starts to create in the mid-50s. Of course, the 50s, that decade cannot be complete without this minor discussion of the atlas, the major output that he did in 53. And in fact, next year, this whole gallery and the Institute will be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the publication of the atlas. And we will be doing a major exhibition devoted to the atlas. And then when we go upstairs, we continue into the 60s. Again, I'm only showing you snippet because of we don't have too much time here, but his fascination with the structure and then the celestial organisms like the moon and things that are invented. And then in the 70s, the progressions in color, in shapes, and then finally we get to the anthologies, the last major series he created primarily in Montecito. It's a very moving, wonderful series, and I'll be talking more about it. But we also devoted a small gallery to telling Herbert's life story in pictures, in words, and ephemera. So we were able to borrow some things from the Aspen Historical Society, as well as create this chronology, putting Herbert's life in a way, a narrative, and then especially for the Aspen visitors to show how important he was for the town of Aspen and for the Aspen Institute, because people have forgotten that part of the story. And we wanted that story to be told. This was extremely important for Linda Resnick and for the Institute, that Herbert's significance for this place that he so loved, that be appreciated for many generations to come. And so I leave you with this final image of the stunning setting that we have for the new center juxtaposed next to Herbert's last building, and with the four gates that now welcome you to this new location, this new art space in Aspen that has been so popular since it opened officially in June, having many, many visitors on a weekly basis, and will hopefully continue to welcome people for many years to come with exhibitions throughout that will be continue to explore what Herbert created and left to this world for us to appreciate. So, and I hope you will all have the opportunity to come to Aspen to visit and see Herbert's masterpiece, the campus of the Aspen Institute, and then visit this Resnick Center for Herbert-Bayer Studies. So if I may, I will move on to the second part, which is talking about this wonderful body of work that Herbert-Bayer created in the last decade of his life, Geometry of an Illusionist. Herbert suffered two major heart attacks in 1974 that necessitated his move from his beloved Aspen to a sea-level town of near Santa Barbara called Montecito. And he so regretted, he felt he was sent into exile when he had to leave. But this also allowed him to start reflect on his life, knowing that he had not an infinite number of years, but his life was now coming to some point where he needs to assess what he has created. And he begins to create this body of work that I have found really very moving and very impressive. And I'm using a quote here from Herbert saying, "The language of forms used for these anthology paintings has been derived to some extent, but not exclusively, from previously used elements of my visual alphabet. Other romantic geometric forms are introduced into a lyrical world with scientific undertones and metaphysical fantasies of a personal universe. Some elements resembling natural phenomena, as well as possible and impossible geometric constructions, descriptive geometry, and cosmogony also appear. They may be called anthologies of my images." I love that he combines the scientific with the romantic in this statement, and this work acts both in those contexts. So here are two, what I think are stunning examples. One on the right, a small work on paper called Anthology with Ladder, and on the left, a very large work on canvas called Blue Anthology. And because you've all seen the exhibition that Elizabeth has prepared, you probably can start recognizing elements in these that you have seen in some of the paintings in the exhibition. And so, for instance, the structural elements, the alphabet, the ladder, the atlas, the geometric forms, all of these are derived from earlier works, but not, duplicated, but inspired by them. So here are, for example, some of the pieces, like this picture from 1928, Tender Picture E from the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, where, type is becoming the main subject of this painting. Or these works from the 30s, the Dunstlocke series with the barns from Austria, as well as this fascination with weather patterns that he starts developing when he is in the United States. Keep in mind this form, remember it, because you'll see it come up again and again. To geometric forms, whether ones he created at the Bauhaus or later in Berlin, this fascination with geometry. And as he stated to Arthur Cohen, he loved geometry. Even as a student in school, geometry was his favorite subject. To the atlas itself, this symbol here of hourglass or infinity, where he places the Earth at the center in the Milky Way galaxy. And if you look at the northern hemisphere, what constellations you would see, and in the southern hemisphere, the other constellations, and this beautiful spread of the astronomy of the sun with the planets, and how amazingly laid out. And remember the form I asked you to remember. Here it comes again in this illustration of the light hitting the surface of the Earth. And then other charts that he created in the atlas, that whether the clouds, the depths of the oceans, the lifespan of various creatures, fauna and flora, the timeline, these very inventive way of illustrating things in the atlas, really fascinating. And then his linear structure series from the 50s. It started in the 40s and goes through the 50s. Or, the chromatic progressions, whether, in various chromes or monochromes. And these are all aspects that make their way into the anthologies. And so I thought, why don't I show you, since I can, in an exhibition, it's hard to place these next to each other because of scale, because of so many constraints, but in a presentation, I can do it. So in 1934, when he goes to Greece with Marcel Breuer, and he creates some very fascinating works in Greece, you see this amphora piece from 1934. The shape itself, as many Greek vessels, tended to be broken, and shards are found and put together to recompose it. The clouds kind of become shards. The temple is included here. But jump to 1980, and he creates this piece, Blue Amphora. This is the small study for the large one that the Lentos Museum lent to our exhibition. And again, you see the shape of the amphora peaking in the back, the clouds and all these other fragments making their way in here. So it's not a direct quote, but you can see these references that he's pulling from an earlier work into the later work. Or here's another example that I find extremely strong and powerful and just very moving, deposition from 1939. It creates, as Hitler is about to invade Poland, this Catholic subject, of Christ having been removed from the cross. And then I love seeing it later references coming up later in this anthology with the ladder. These diagonals that echo the diagonals in the ladder here that shows up here. Again, incorporated are the clouds, the geometric forms, the alphabet. So it's a mixture of things along. And then here again, we see this wonderful shape he created for the atlas, making an appearance in one of the most profound paintings he created in the series, Geometry of an Illusionist. And I will talk more about it in a moment. Or the charts that he did, this succession of life chart that then starts to be quoted in a different way in this painting, or the heights of the mountains that start to make their appearances on the periphery of this composition. It's fascinating how he pulls this. And in this case, another wonderful piece from the Lentos Museum, he actually ripped this part of the page here and pasted it along with various maps and illustrations that he used in the atlas. So this is, just a great quote here that he put himself right there. So I had the pleasure and honor of meeting his second studio assistant, Paul Hobson, when I was preparing the anthology exhibition in 2009, and have maintained that relationship with him. And Paul talked about how Herbert every day had to draw or paint, whether he drew directly on graph paper or then drew on little pieces of vellum and pasted them in his notebook. Jonathan Bayer in London has these notebooks, and I had the privilege of seeing them and just marveling at how prolific Herbert Bayer was and how many compositions he created. Well, out of these little drawings would come a little painting, usually on paper, anywhere between 10-inch by 10-inch to 20 by 20 inches, always square, not always, for the most part, square, and usually using some water medium like acrylic with the pencil drawing on paper. So when I visited Gwen in 2009 in preparation for the exhibition, she showed me these beautiful mylar drawings that they had that related to these compositions. And these mylar drawings, again, through the help of computers, you can superimpose them, because I couldn't do them physically since the painting was in Montecito in this case, and the mylar drawing was in Aspen. But because of Photoshop, I can put the mylar over the acrylic, and show you how, in this case, once you put it over it, you see the relationship he's looking at and the changes he's starting to make in the drawing. And in the large canvas that he eventually created 3 years later, you see there's very little shift. There are minor shifts that happen, but for the most part, this large composition is very similar to the small composition he created 3 years earlier. And I wanted to show you again here where you see the small acrylic on paper that he did, and then the mylar that Denver Art Museum owns. And you look at all the numbers and all the calculations he's making. And when you look at the composition, you don't think that there is all this thought and time spent on figuring every little detail, but it gives you an appreciation of how meticulous he was and how important every little element was. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of the large canvas here. I have seen only an image, and it's low resolution. I couldn't show it to you, but I have a great example in which I can show you all the phases and this masterpiece of his, Geometry of an Illusionist. So this is the small work on paper. That's 20 by 20 inches. And very beautiful, very exquisite. And in this case, there are multiple studies for this paintings that Herbert executes. And in this instance, it's on vellum. And you can see he's starting to work various ideas, like how do I deal with the spheres? There are notes about color, about geometries, about all sorts of things that he is considering for this composition. Well, then when we remove this and look at the mylar drawing he did, you can see how the composition has already started shifting from what we had previously seen. Calculations are happening. In this case, the arrows that were here have moved up. The shape has moved up. This chromatic grid is now no longer in this corner, but is more towards the center. There's a shape here that's being introduced. The scale bar has moved from here more to the center. So obviously he's thinking of this composition in more ways than one. And then when we finally look at the large piece, and or when I impose the drawing on the small painting, you see some of the shifts that have happened. So this in the drawing was over here. It's now moved down here. The infinity symbol or hourglass has moved from here to here. The sphere has moved over to the right. The gridded chroma scale has moved from the bottom left to the center. So he's already made various changes to this composition. And then when you look at the large painting, which is more faithful to the Mylar drawing, many things you can see now, seeing them side by side, how the two compositions are no longer the same. Definitely the inspiration is in the early work, but the large canvas, and I wish you could see the large canvas because it is a very large piece and it really brings you into it and you see things that you might not see. For instance, these 4 dots that on an image like this you might not think as significant, but when you are standing in front of a painting, you realize this is a square. He has a square within a square. The infinity symbol moving from the side to here now lines up with all these dots, this constellation that's leading to this impossible geometry. These arrows are no longer arrows, but elegant movement lines. He's left the canvas unpainted on the edges on purpose. This give and take of positive, negative is one of the most intriguing. And to me, this painting has become a way of my looking at it and seeing it in a very different way from when I looked at it in 2009, that I start to see, and this is me interpreting it, that this is really a personal piece. It's a biographical piece, geometry of an illusionist. He's the illusionist, and these are the geometrical shapes that he's playing with and creating this amazing composition. So this series really takes on a whole different meaning when, again, you look at works like these titled Ancient Secrets and According to Fibonacci. People who look at Ancient Secrets go, oh, this has to do with theosophy or has to do with some Eastern religion. The symbolisms that they see are being illustrated. They connect with them on a spiritual level that, with a title like Ancient Secrets, you're allowed to go in and look at that in a different way. And the same with According to Fibonacci, this sun-like motif that illuminates all these shapes that are beneath it. And then you go to 2 paintings, larger works, Belle Nuit Géométrique and Nocturnal with 7, where you're looking and seeing, again, I wish you could see these in person because the background is so heavily painted. It's not a flat color anymore. There's just a lot of movement happening in the background color as well as in the shapes and forms that are on top of it. And again, I will go back to a quote that Herbert left us, saying, a deeper meaning comes to the sensitive viewer from beyond the ambiguous titles, which sometimes are arbitrary or on purpose misleading. There is more than what meets the eye. As in writing, where the essence is often found between the words, the meaning in the paintings is found beyond the images. This gave me license to look at these works and say, I want to see them in a different way, and has allowed viewers to also look at them and start seeing beyond the shapes. And so go back to the exhibition, look at this phenomenal work that Elizabeth has installed in the gallery, one of the largest anthologies that he created. It's quite a phenomenal piece. And I had the luck of seeing it in 2009 when I visited Linz and saw Elizabeth's exhibition back then. I wish I could be with you to, again, see this painting and many others that are on display. But these suspended secrets, Herbert's is inviting you to go in, to look at these, to read into them, and not just accept them for surface decoration, but things that could lead you in this day and age where we're all looking for some kind of meaning. I think these paintings are very appropriate today and help, look at the world in a different way. So I thank you for your time, for listening to me as I talk about this beautiful series of work, and to introduce you to the Resnick Center, and hope that I can meet some of you in person and be able to continue sharing our love of Herbert-Bayer's work and what it means to all of us.
Hello, Bernard. Do you hear me?
Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, Bernard. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Everything worked perfect. We had a wonderful insight into the Resnick Center and also to the anthology series. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And it was a great lecture. Thank you. And I have a question. You talked about Paul Hobson, the assistant of Herbert, who worked for Herbert for the late years. They worked together. Do you know he's still working as an artist in Aspen or in the surrounding? And have you ever talked with Paul? And if yes, do you know, especially in the late theory, how big was the artistic part of the assistant? So did Herbert make the drawings, and then Paul did the paintings together with the old master, or how did it work? Do you know?
Yes, I do, and I still am in touch with Paul. Paul is happy, healthy. He's had a few health issues, but he still is practicing artist in San Diego. He creates wonderful public spaces, art, as well as personal artwork. Some of it really inspired by Herbert, never quoting Herbert, but very inspired by him. And we have a nice friendship, and we talk regularly. And when I did my 2009 exhibition, I spent a lot of time interviewing him, and I published an essay in my little catalog talking about the working process. So thank you for asking. So yes, Herbert, as you saw, would start with pencil sketches and color pencils. And then from those, he would get inspired to make the work on paper that it was usually small. But those small paintings did not always become large paintings. And then Paul said, for whatever reason which he could not understand, Herbert would say, prepare a canvas in these dimensions, 30 by 30, 50 by 50, 70 by 70, 80 by 80. And although it felt to Paul as if it was random, he said Herbert always had his own reasons for why he was selecting the dimensions. So then Paul would prepare the canvas, and Herbert would ask him to put the ground color, and then trace from those mylar. They would project them on the canvas, and he would trace the drawing that Herbert had after he made all the calculations and shifted all these things that you saw in the little drawings I showed you. He would then draw those on the canvas, and then Herbert would start working. And Paul said, his job was primarily to mix the colors, get everything down to Herbert's very, very, very specific specifications, because Herbert was so meticulous about color and would yell at Paul if he ever got the color wrong, and was very, very particular. So, a lot of the time Paul was just mixing colors. But the relationship grew as Herbert started to trust Paul more, and especially in later years as Herbert became more feeble, and in one case where he had an accident and could not use his right hand, Paul was getting more involved. But as he told me, it was always Herbert's painting. This was never Paul's painting. Herbert had to come in, and even his other studio assistant, Dick Carter, who worked with him in Aspen, where the paintings were more flat rather than more painterly. He said Herbert always came in and he had to do the last bit of painting even on those earlier works. But with the anthology series, Herbert was much more involved with the creation of the pieces. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And again, congratulations to the wonderful Resnick Center. How many visitors do you have since the opening? So the opening was in June.
Yes.
Is it crowded now? Or
Well, Aspen is seasonal. And when you were there, Elizabeth, that was the height of the summer season. And in the first 2 weeks, they had 700 visitors, which was phenomenal. And then it was about 200 visitors a week. Now that Aspen is deserted because people leave after September, they're having about 25 to 35 visitors a week, which is amazing for a very small building where people never used to feel welcomed, or at least that's what I heard. People never felt welcome on the campus of the Institute. Now people have a reason. And and especially Lissa, who you've met, encourages people, and they take them on walking tour to place the whole campus in context and show how Herbert created this whole campus. And it's not just about what you see inside the building, but encourage people to walk through this 40 acres of amazing setting that Herbert Bayer created, various buildings, sculptures, and everything that you see there.